welcome to session 1 of our study on the rule of life. If you've been following our Sunday morning teaching series up to this point, we're following a very natural progression through Jesus' message on the Mount. The first section, the first 12 verses, have to do with character. These are what we commonly call the Beatitudes, and Jesus is calling our character to take on a different aspect than what you find in the secular world or even what you find in the nominal church. Jesus goes from talking about character then to talking about influence. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Now I want you to take those two together, because if you're a part of First Baptist Tulsa, this should sound very familiar to you, that we are developing character and we're having influence. In other words, we're developing as a Jesus follower who then becomes a difference maker for a world of people far from God. And that is our vision as a church as to where we're going and what we're trying to accomplish. So, trying to bring the teachings of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount and try to take it from a theological or just a theoretical vision to making it very practical and very lived out in our lives. That is what this study is for the rule of life. And what I want to do in our brief few moments tonight is I want to provide you a little bit of information, but more than that, I want to provide you with some inspiration. Now, hopefully by now you've picked up a copy of Ken Shigematsu's book, God and My Everything, and I hope you've read the first section of this on the rule of life, roughly pages 11 through 39. If you've not read that, I would encourage you to stop now, go to our YouTube channel later and watch this video. But I really would encourage you to have read that section first, because tonight I really want to wrap our minds around what is a rule of life. And with this information and inspiration, this will help us to develop our own rule of life. Okay, so let's start with the information. When we talk about a rule of life, what are we talking about? And that word rule, and Shigematsu talks about this in his book, actually goes back to an old Latin word, regula, for a trellis. So if you have a plant that, for lack of a better metaphor, doesn't have any backbone, can't hold up under its own weight, a trellis would be provided so that it could bear the weight of the plant and that it would grow and be more healthy. When we talk about a rule of life, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about some kind of structure, habits, if you will, that help us grow in our relationship with Christ. And through this whole thing, I want you to keep asking yourself the question, what are the habits that I have, or what are some habits I can develop that will help me be a better follower of Jesus? So probably the best known rule in history is the rule of Saint Benedict. So most of you know who are part of First Tulsa that I go to a monastery every quarter, 4 times a year. I go out for a time of retreat and renewal. And the group of 50 monks that live out in rural Oklahoma, they still live by the rule of St. Benedict. Just roughly speaking, St. Benedict lived about 500 years after Jesus, and he realized that if people were going to live in community together and try to seek Christ together, there needed to be some guidelines for this. So this particular rule, it's in this little pamphlet form, it's just 96 pages. It's not very long at all. It has 73 chapters, but really the chapters are just very, very short. And what St. Benedict is doing here is he's providing a trellis. He's providing a structure by which a community can live. And he says this once at the beginning of the rule and once at the end of the rule: prefer nothing to Christ. That's his goal. We want to live our whole lives for Christ. So I find it interesting that same phrase is used at the beginning of the rule and at the end. Between the two, here are the habits that the monks would try to develop and observe within community. So if you read the rule of St. Benedict, what you'll discover is he covers a lot of detail. Sometimes it's the small habits that can make a big difference. And perhaps you've heard that illustration before of the steel beam that's suspended from the ceiling by a chain, and somebody has a cork suspended from the ceiling by a string. And if that person will be patient enough and just ding that cork against that steel beam on a regular basis once every couple of seconds, then what's going to happen is at first that steel beam is not going to respond. But then after a while, if it's consistent enough, that steel beam will start to sway back and forth. It's just that consistency of that little tap that starts to produce this inertia within this huge beam. And so sometimes little habits can make a big difference. So for instance, in the Rule of St. Benedict, one thing he talks about is sleeping arrangements. And there's a whole chapter on sleeping arrangements. And that seems like almost a trivial thing. If we're trying to seek God, why do you need to talk about sleeping arrangements? But what St. Benedict says is he acknowledges you just don't feel good if you don't have a full night's sleep, right? So he encourages people to sleep in the monastery, the men to sleep, the younger interdispersed throughout the older. So what happens is in the middle of the night when they get up and go to prayer, the older, more disciplined men can say, it's time to get up, let's get going, and their wisdom can counteract a bit of the youthful sloth, right? And so it's just a very small habit, but it's a very important habit. So pulling that into how you develop your own habits, these are not just big lofty goals. These sometimes are very simple, earthy things. So in my particular rule of life, I have a certain amount of sleep that I need every night to function well. And so I have that as a part of my rule. I'm going to get X amount of sleep every night, and I'm going to go to bed at the same time, all right? So I like to get up early. That's just me. I do my best work in the morning. So I'm in bed most nights at 9:30. Now, does that mean that that's got to be your rule? No. Does that mean that I always do it? No. Hey, Friday, Saturday night, sometimes I stay up quite a bit later. But for me as a follower of Jesus, I need a certain amount of sleep. And I just discovered my body responds well to, hey, 9:30, my body tells me it's time to go to sleep. I'm tired anyway. And for me, just sitting there mindlessly watching TV, it's going to be fruitless, right? So that's a habit that I've gotten in throughout the years. Again, that doesn't have to be your rule, but that's my rule. So sometimes it's those little habits that make a big difference. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a rule of life. It's creating some structure around which habits can form, and those habits make us better followers of Jesus. So whenever we talk about rule, just think about trellis, think about habits, right? Now I want to offer you a little bit of inspiration. As we go through this study, and in Shigematsu's outline here, what he's done is he has some major groupings of roots, relationships, restoration, reaching out. In my own rule of life, and I'm just going to give it to you just in bits and pieces, just parts of it, because the goal is for you not to copy me, it's to discover your own rule. So here's my simple rule of life. I have categories that I've addressed in here, such as my work, renewal, my spiritual practices, my relationships, and my resources. Okay, that's how I've mapped it out. But I didn't start with this outline in mind. As I went through Shigematsu's book, as I was reading, I was like, you know what? I have a really good practice in this area. Say it's with sleep, I've got a really good practice. Let me just kind of codify that, and I just jotted it down in the book. And then after I went through the entire book and I had all these different rules, then I started to group them under some major headings. So as you go through this, you don't have to have a grand plan or a big outline in mind. Just start to identify some habits that when you practice them, you become a better follower of Christ. And I would think in 3 categories. First, what are some habits you need to start doing? Okay, some new habits that you need to learn. So one of my rule of life has to do with eating. Okay, so let me give you a warning here. Don't try to set a lofty goal. This is not about a diet program. This is about something that you're willing to practice for the rest of your life. Doesn't mean it's not going to change, but from where you are today, you're going, I'm looking at the long haul for this. So this is not adopting a fad of a diet. It's not about losing 20 pounds. Here's going to be the rule of how I live and how I eat, right? So what are some things you need to start doing? What are some habits you need to stop doing? Okay, you have your start doings and then your stop doings. Maybe you have some habits that you need to unlearn. So for many of us, our internet habits are atrocious, right? And so what you need to do is say, I've just gotten into some bad habits, so I'm going to unlearn some of those habits and relearn them in a new way. So things you can start doing, things you can start, I'm messing this up, things you can start doing, things you can stop doing, and then things you need to keep doing. So as I went through the rule of life, I quickly discovered one thing that I'm already doing that just makes for a pretty good rule, and that is an hour before bed every night I read. Okay, not only does my mind absorb some really fruitful things before I go to sleep, but my eyes start getting tired because I'm reading. And studies have shown over and over, if you look at an iPhone or a computer screen before you go to bed, that particular blue light just wakes you up, and you find it hard to go to sleep. So by unplugging that hour before, just by reading, there's a lot of benefits. And so for me, one of my rules is that I read an hour before bed every night. Now, is it 7 days a week? No, but typically that's where you're going to find me at the last part of my day. It was something I was already doing, and I didn't need to go out and stop or start doing something. I just needed to keep doing what I was doing because it was actually producing some pretty good fruit. So to kind of button all this up, trying to keep each one of these studies between 10, 15 minutes or so. Hopefully you've got some information now on what a rule of life is. It's a trellis, it's a structure, it's habits that we want to put the weight on those habits, and not resolves, not a to-do list, not a checklist. We want to put some weight on some habits that will help us grow. And hopefully the inspiration that you have here is just to be creative. Again, you don't have to follow Shigematsu's model or my model. There's plenty of examples in the back. There's no one right way to create a rule of life, okay? But what you need to do is you need to answer, what are the habits that when I practice them, I become a better follower of Jesus Christ? Now, let me also say this before we button this up. I want to encourage you over the next month to be developing this rule of life, and hopefully beginning in September, you can say, okay, I've got these habits. I'm going to start reminding myself and reviewing these. Realize that you're not writing these in stone, okay? As you go through, maybe in a couple of years, one habit just kind of starts wearing you thin, or a season of life changes and you need to change certain habits. This is always meant to be in flux. In fact, St. Benedict has a disclaimer. A few times in his rule, he will say, here's what I advise for monasteries, but if your local conditions and local resources are different, do what you think best. So even with this classic rule that's been around for 1,500 years, he said, circumstances are going to change, and you need to roll with it sometimes, right? Okay. So hopefully you've read the first part of this book on the rule. What I want to encourage you next time is to read the section on roots, chapters 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 in Shigematsu, starting on page 43, and you'll read almost to page 80. So just read those 3 chapters, and we're going to talk about, next week, we're going to talk about some spiritual disciplines, putting those in place, some habits that we put into place to help us to be the best follower of Jesus that we can be, okay? So do this prayerfully. This is something for you and God to work on together. What are the habits that will help you to continue to become, until you completely become, like Jesus Christ? God bless you. Thanks for being a part of the study, and I'll see you next Monday night. Bye-bye.